In the remote highlands of Myanmar, hidden within a monastery that has stood for over 800 years, there exists a collection of stones that should not exist. These are not ordinary stones. They are not religious artifacts in the traditional sense. They are something else entirely. The monks who guard them call them the Naga stones, named after the serpent beings of ancient legend. And according to these monks, these stones are not 800 years old. They are not even 8,000 years old. They claim these stones are remnants from a civilization that existed before the last great cataclysm, before the floods, before recorded history as we know it. They claim these stones are over 100,000 years old. Now, I know what you are thinking. 100,000 years? That is impossible. Human civilization, as we have been taught, only goes back about 6,000 years. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley, these are the oldest civilizations we acknowledge. Everything before that, we are told, was just scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers, barely surviving, certainly not creating advanced cultures or technologies. But what if that story is incomplete? What if there was something before, something that was deliberately forgotten, or perhaps more accurately, something that was deliberately hidden? The Naga stones are kept in a locked chamber that most visitors to the monastery never see. Only a select few monks are allowed to enter this chamber, and they do so with reverence that borders on fear. When researchers have been granted rare access to photograph these stones, what they found was perplexing. The stones are covered in symbols, not the Burmese script you would expect, not Sanskrit, not any known language from the region. The symbols are geometric, mathematical, astronomical. They show star patterns, orbital mechanics, concepts that should not have been understood by ancient peoples. And yet here they are, carved into stone, guarded by monks who have been told, generation after generation, that these stones contain knowledge from the before time. The before time, that is what the elder monks call it. They speak of it in hushed voices, always with a mixture of awe and sorrow. According to their oral tradition, passed down through countless generations, there was once a great land in the Eastern Ocean, a motherland of civilization, a place of unimaginable advancement and wisdom. This land, they say, was the origin point of human enlightenment, the place where the first priests learned the sacred sciences, where humanity first understood the cosmos, where the foundations of all later civilizations were laid. And then, in a single catastrophic event, it was gone, swallowed by the sea, destroyed by forces beyond comprehension. The only survivors were a select few, the priests, the knowledge keepers, those who had been trained in the deepest mysteries, and these priests scattered across the world, carrying with them fragments of the old wisdom, establishing new traditions, new lineages, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to know the truth again. This story, you might think, sounds like mythology. It sounds like every other flood legend, every other lost continent tale that has captured human imagination for centuries. But here is where it gets interesting. This is not just a story told in Myanmar. This exact same story, with remarkably similar details, appears in cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean. In Tamil Nadu, in southern India, there is an ancient tradition that speaks of Kumari Kandam, a vast continent that once existed south of India, extending far into the Indian Ocean. The Tamil Sangam literature, some of the oldest written texts in India, references this lost land repeatedly. They describe it as the original homeland of the Tamil people, a place of great cities and advanced learning, a place where 3 great sangams, or academies of poets and scholars, flourished for thousands of years before the sea consumed it all. The Tamil scholars are very specific about this. They are not speaking metaphorically. They provide geographic details. They name cities. They describe the extent of the land. And modern geological surveys have confirmed something remarkable. There was indeed a landmass there. During the last ice age, when sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today, a significant portion of what is now underwater off the coast of southern India was above sea level. This was real land. People lived there. And when the ice age ended, when the glaciers melted, that land disappeared beneath the waves. The Tamil people remember this. It is encoded in their oldest texts. in their cultural memory, in their religious traditions. Now, the Tamils call their lost land Kumari Kandam. In Myanmar, the monks speak of the Eastern Motherland, but in other parts of the world, this same lost civilization has another name. In Polynesia, the legends speak of Hiva, the ancestral homeland from which the first voyagers came. In Japan, there are traditions of Mu, the sunken empire of the Sunday, among certain esoteric groups in the West, influenced by the research of a British colonel named James Churchward in the early 20th century. This lost continent is called Mu or Lemuria, a vast landmass that supposedly stretched across much of the Pacific Ocean. Churchward claimed that he learned of Mu from ancient tablets he discovered in India, tablets written in a language he called Narkal, supposedly the original language of humanity. According to these tablets, Mu was not just a continent, it was the birthplace of human civilization itself, a land that existed for tens of thousands of years, a place of incredible technological and spiritual advancement, ruled by a priest class who understood sciences we are only beginning to rediscover today. And when Mu sank, around 12,000 years ago, the priests who survived became the founders of every major ancient civilization we know. They went to Egypt and became the mystery school initiates. They went to India and became the Vedic rishis. They went to Central America and became the Mayan and Aztec priesthoods. They carried the knowledge, protected it, coded it into monuments and texts and oral traditions, waiting for future generations to be wise enough to understand. Now, mainstream archaeology dismisses all of this as pseudoscience, as fantasy, as the wishful thinking of people who want to believe in a more romantic past. And to be fair, many of Churchward's claims cannot be verified. The tablets he said he translated have never been produced for independent examination. Much of his linguistic analysis has been thoroughly debunked. But here is the thing. Just because Churchward got details wrong, just because he may have embellished or misinterpreted his sources, does not mean the core idea is false. Because the evidence for a lost advanced civilization, or at least for a lost civilization more advanced than we have been taught, keeps appearing. It appears in stone. It appears in genetic data. It appears in linguistic connections that should not exist. It appears in the persistent, haunting memory of every major culture on Earth that there was a time before our time, and that time ended in catastrophe. The Naga stones in Myanmar are just one piece of this puzzle, but they represent something crucial. They represent a living tradition, an unbroken lineage of knowledge keepers who have maintained their role for longer than we can properly comprehend. These monks are not performing for tourists. They are not engaging in New Age fantasy. They are doing what their predecessors have done for millennia, guarding knowledge they believe is too dangerous or too sacred to be released carelessly into the world. And they are not alone. Across the world, there are other lineages, other priest classes, other knowledge keepers who trace their origins back to this same lost source. In Polynesia, the Kahuna, the priestly class of Hawaii, and other island groups, possess oral traditions that speak of their ancestors coming from a sunken homeland, bringing with them advanced navigation techniques, astronomical knowledge, and spiritual practices that allowed them to thrive on tiny islands in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. The precision of Polynesian navigation is still not fully understood by modern science. These were people who could sail thousands of miles across open ocean with no instruments, no maps, navigating by stars, by wave patterns, by methods they claim were taught by the ancient priests. In Tibet, there are Bon practitioners, followers of the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet, who maintain that their traditions originated from a land called Shambhala, a place that existed in a previous age of the world. The Bon teachings include sophisticated cosmological models, medical knowledge, and practices for consciousness exploration that modern researchers are only beginning to take seriously. These are not primitive superstitions. These are complex, internally consistent systems of knowledge that had to come from somewhere. In India, beyond the Tamil traditions of Kumari Kandam, there are the Naga priest lineages, esoteric groups who claim descent from the serpent people, semi-divine beings who possessed wisdom from before the flood. The Nagas appear throughout Hindu and Buddhist mythology, always associated with water, with hidden knowledge, with treasures and secrets kept beneath the earth or beneath the sea. Are these purely symbolic, or are they cultural memories of an actual group, an actual priesthood, that survived a maritime catastrophe and carried their knowledge inland? In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples possess what is quite possibly the longest continuous oral tradition in human history. Their Dreamtime stories include accounts of the coastline changing, of lands that were once dry becoming submerged, of ancestors walking across plains that are now ocean floor. And here is the remarkable thing. When scientists began to study these stories seriously, they found that the Aboriginal accounts of coastal geography match the actual coastline as it existed more than 10,000 years ago, before the post-Ice Age sea level rise. These people have maintained accurate geographic memory for over 10 millennia. What else do they remember? What other knowledge has been preserved in their oral traditions? So we have these scattered lineages, these priest classes, these knowledge keepers, all claiming the same basic story. There was an advanced civilization before ours. It was destroyed in a cataclysm. A select few survived and scattered, carrying fragments of the old knowledge. They established new traditions in new lands, and they have been waiting, protecting, preparing for the time when humanity would be ready to receive the knowledge again. But why the secrecy? Why not just tell everyone? Why guard this knowledge so carefully for so long? The monks in Myanmar, when pressed, will sometimes speak of this. They say the knowledge is dangerous. Not morally dangerous, but practically dangerous. They say the old civilization had technologies, had capabilities that we are not ready for. They say that part of what destroyed the old world was the misuse of these technologies, the application of knowledge without wisdom. And so the priests made a decision, long ago, that the knowledge would be released gradually, carefully, only when humanity had matured enough to handle it responsibly. This might sound paternalistic, or even conspiratorial, but consider the implications. If there really was an advanced civilization that destroyed itself, if there really are technologies or knowledge systems that are powerful enough to be genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands, then perhaps keeping them secret makes sense. We live in a world where we have nuclear weapons, where we have bioengineering capabilities, where we have technologies that could end human civilization if misused. We already have dangerous knowledge. The question is, what other dangerous knowledge might be hidden, waiting? Hey, if you are still with me at this point, if this story is resonating with you, I want you to do something. Do not just watch, join us. Hit that subscribe button, because this channel is dedicated to exploring exactly these kinds of mysteries. The stories that mainstream sources will not tell you, the evidence that gets ignored or suppressed. And turn on that notification bell, because what we are about to uncover in the rest of this investigation is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about human history. Trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Now, back to our story. Because the Naga stones and the priest lineages are just the beginning. The real question is, what exactly are they protecting? What is this 100,000-year-old secret? According to the traditions, the secret has multiple layers. The first layer is historical, the knowledge of what really happened, the true timeline of human civilization, the actual story of where we came from and what we have lost. This alone would be revolutionary. It would rewrite every history textbook, challenge every archaeological paradigm, force us to completely reconsider what we think we know about the human journey. But there is a second layer, and this is where it gets really interesting. The technological layer. The priests claim that the old civilization had capabilities we have lost. Not magic, but science, advanced understanding of energy, of consciousness, of the relationship between mind and matter. They had ways of working with stone, with crystal, with sound, that we no longer understand. They had knowledge of astronomy that we are only now rediscovering with our telescopes and satellites. They had medical techniques that modern doctors are beginning to validate through research into traditional healing practices. And then there is the third layer, the most controversial and the most frightening, the cyclical layer, the knowledge that what happened before can happen again, that the cataclysm that destroyed the old world was not random but part of a pattern, a cycle that repeats, and that we might be approaching another turn of that cycle right now. This is what the priests are really protecting. Not just history, Not just technology, but warning, knowledge of what is coming, and perhaps if we are ready, knowledge of how to survive it. The Naga stones, with their astronomical calculations and geometric precision, are said to contain encoded information about celestial cycles, about patterns in the sky that repeat over vast spans of time. The Tamil texts speak of the yugas, the great ages of the world, each ending in destruction and renewal. The Mayan calendar, which caused such a stir in 2012, was not predicting the end of the world, but marking the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new one. These are not independent mythologies. These are all pieces of the same knowledge system, the same understanding of cosmic time, preserved by different branches of the same original priesthood. So the question becomes, who are these priests today? Do they still exist? Are there still lineages of knowledge keepers actively protecting these secrets, actively waiting for the right moment to reveal what they know? The evidence suggests yes. The monks in Myanmar are not acting alone. They are part of a network, informal perhaps, not centrally organized, but connected through shared tradition and shared purpose. When researchers and truth seekers have managed to gain the trust of these knowledge keepers, they consistently report the same experience. They are told that there is much more, but that they are not ready to hear it all. They are given pieces, fragments, tantalizing hints, but never the complete picture, always with the understanding that the full revelation will come when the time is right. And that time, some of these priests suggest, may be approaching. We live in an age of unprecedented technological advancement, but also unprecedented danger. We have the capability to destroy ourselves, but also, perhaps, the wisdom to choose differently. The old world, according to the legends, failed this test. They had the technology, but not the wisdom. They built wonders, but destroyed themselves. The question is, will we be different? Will we prove ourselves worthy of the knowledge that has been held in trust for 100,000 years? This is not ancient history we are talking about. This is not abstract philosophy. This is about us, right now, at this moment in time. Because if the priests are right, if there really is a cycle, if there really is a pattern, then understanding what happened before is not just academically interesting. It is survival critical. It is the difference between learning from the past and being doomed to repeat it. So that is what we are going to explore in this investigation. We are going to trace the evidence for this lost civilization, this Mu, this Lemuria, this Kumari Kandam, whatever name you want to give it. We are going to look at the geological evidence, the archaeological anomalies, the persistent myths and legends. We are going to examine what the priests actually teach, what knowledge they actually preserve. We are going to investigate the technologies they claim existed, and see if modern science is beginning to catch up. And we are going to ask the hard questions. What really happened 12,000 years ago? What caused the cataclysm? Could it happen again? And what do the knowledge keepers know that we do not? Because somewhere in the mountains of Myanmar, in a locked chamber guarded by monks who take their duty with absolute seriousness, there are stones that should not exist. And those stones are not alone. They are part of a much larger story, a story that has been hidden for far too long, a story about who we really are, where we really came from, and what we might be capable of if we could remember what we have forgotten. The priests of Mu have kept their secret for 100,000 years, but the time of secrecy may be ending, the time of revelation may be beginning, and what we are about to discover might change everything. The story of Mu, as a modern concept, begins with a man who was either one of history's most brilliant researchers or one of its most convincing storytellers. His name was James Churchward, and in the early 1900s, he made a claim that would influence esoteric thought for the next century. Churchward was a British military officer stationed in India, and according to his account, while there, he befriended an elderly priest at a monastery. This priest, over time, came to trust Churchward enough to show him something extraordinary. Hidden in the monastery's archives were a set of ancient tablets, inscribed in a language the priest called Narkal. This language, the priest explained, was the original tongue of humanity, the first written language, predating all others by tens of thousands of years. Churchward claimed he spent years learning to read these tablets with the priest's guidance, and what he found recorded in them was nothing short of astounding. The tablets told the complete history of a vast continent called Mu, which had existed in the Pacific Ocean for over 50,000 years. This was not a primitive society. According to the tablets, Mu was a thriving empire with a population of 64 million people living in great cities, possessing advanced sciences, sophisticated social structures, and spiritual knowledge that encompassed the fundamental nature of reality itself. The civilization of Mu, the tablets claimed, had sent colonizers across the entire world, establishing what would later become the ancient civilizations we know today. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, all of them were essentially colonies or cultural descendants of Mu, the motherland, the source of all human advancement. And then, approximately 12,000 years ago, the tablets described a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Massive earthquakes struck, volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, the land itself fractured and sank. In a matter of days, possibly hours, the entire continent of Mu disappeared beneath the Pacific Ocean, taking with it nearly the entire population and almost all evidence of this advanced civilization. Only a few survived, primarily those who had already settled in the colonies, those who carried the knowledge and the memory of what was lost. Now, Churchward went on to write several books about Mu, each filled with elaborate details, diagrams, interpretations of ancient symbols, and claims about the civilization's technology and culture. He presented the story with absolute confidence, citing the Nakul tablets as his primary source, along with various other ancient texts and archaeological evidence he believed supported his thesis. The problem is that Churchward never produced these tablets for independent examination. He never revealed the exact location of the monastery. He never provided verifiable documentation that would allow other researchers to confirm his claims. And when linguists examined his translations and his assertions about ancient languages, they found significant problems. His interpretations of Mayan glyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and other ancient scripts often contradicted established scholarship and sometimes appeared to be simply incorrect. So mainstream academia dismissed Churchward entirely. He was labelled a fraud, a fantasist, someone who had either deliberately fabricated the entire story or who had severely misunderstood and misrepresented legitimate ancient texts. And for decades, that was the end of it. Mu was relegated to the realm of pseudo-archaeology, mentioned in the same breath as Atlantis and other legendary lost continents. Interesting stories, but nothing more. But here is where it gets complicated. Because even if Churchward got the details wrong, even if his tablets never existed or were misinterpreted, the core idea he was presenting, the concept of a lost Pacific civilization, is not as crazy as it first appears. In fact, modern geology and archaeology have revealed evidence that makes the concept not only plausible, but in some ways undeniable. Let us start with the most basic question. Could a landmass in the Pacific Ocean have existed and then disappeared? The answer is absolutely yes. In fact, we now know it did. During the last ice age, which lasted from approximately 115,000 years ago until about 11,700 years ago, sea levels around the world were dramatically lower than they are today. How much lower? Between 300 and 400 feet lower. Think about what that means. Vast areas of what is now ocean floor were dry land. People lived there. Civilizations could have existed there. And then, when the Ice Age ended, when the massive glaciers that covered much of North America and Europe began to melt, all that water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels rose. And the coastal lands, the river valleys, the plains where people had been living for thousands of years, they all flooded. This is not speculation. This is established geological fact. The flooding happened. We can see it in the geological record. We can map the ancient coastlines, and what we find is remarkable. In Southeast Asia, there was a landmass called Sundaland, connecting what are now the separate islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of Southeast Asia into one continuous land. It was enormous, adding millions of square miles to the Asian continent, and it is gone now, submerged beneath the South China Sea and the Java Sea. People lived on Sundaland. We have evidence of this. And when it flooded, those people had to go somewhere. They migrated to higher ground, to the mountains that became islands, carrying with them their cultures, their languages, their knowledge. But it is not just Sundaland. Off the coast of India, geological surveys have confirmed that there was indeed more land exposed during the Ice Age, precisely where the Tamil legends place Kumari Kandam. The ancient Tamil texts are not making it up. They are remembering something that actually happened. Their ancestors witnessed the flooding of their coastal homelands as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose. And then there is Zealandia. This is perhaps the most extraordinary example because it is not ancient history. It is current science. In 2017, geologists officially recognized Zealandia as Earth's eighth continent. It is a massive landmass, about half the size of Australia, that is almost entirely submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean. Only a few peaks remain above water today, forming New Zealand and a handful of smaller islands. But Zealandia is a real continent, with continental crust, clear boundaries, and a distinct geological identity. It is just underwater. Now, Zealandia has been submerged for millions of years, so it is not the same as Mu in terms of timeline, but it proves beyond any doubt that large land masses can and do exist beneath the Pacific Ocean, hidden from casual observation. So, geologically, the idea of a Pacific landmass is sound. The question becomes, was there actually a civilization there? Is there any physical evidence? This is where we have to be very careful, because the evidence is fragmentary, controversial, and subject to intense debate. But there are locations, there are structures that demand explanation. The most famous is probably the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Discovered in 1986 by a dive operator, the Yonaguni structure is a massive formation of stone blocks, platforms, steps, and what appear to be carved features, all lying at depths between 5 and 40 meters beneath the sea. When marine geologist Masaaki Kimura examined the site, he concluded that it was at least partially artificial, carved by human hands, perhaps 10,000 years ago when the area was above sea level. Other geologists disagree, arguing that the formations are entirely natural, created by erosion and tectonic activity. The debate continues. But what is undeniable is that the structure exists. It is remarkable, and if it is artificial, it predates known Japanese civilization by thousands of years. Then there is Nan Madol, in Micronesia. Now, Nan Madol is not underwater, at least not entirely, but it is built on a coral reef lagoon, with massive basalt columns weighing many tons arranged to form artificial islands and structures. The conventional dating places Nan Madol's construction at around 1,000 years ago. But some researchers argue that the foundation structures, the megalithic base, could be much older, potentially dating to a time when sea levels were lower. The oral traditions of the local people support this, claiming that Nan Madol was built by ancient sorcerers using magic to levitate the stones. Strip away the supernatural explanation, and you are left with a story about advanced building techniques from a much earlier time. Around the Pacific, there are other anomalies. Underwater structures off the coast of Cuba that some claim show geometric patterns inconsistent with natural formation. Sonar images of what might be pyramids on the ocean floor near Japan and near Taiwan. Massive stone anchors and structures in the waters around Polynesia that are difficult to explain using conventional chronology. None of these individually proves the existence of Mu, but collectively, they create a pattern that is hard to ignore. There is something in the Pacific, something old, something that does not fit neatly into our established timeline of human development. And then there is the cultural evidence, which in many ways is even more compelling than the physical evidence, because if there was a Pacific motherland civilization, if there was a cultural source point from which ancient peoples spread across the world, we would expect to see certain signatures. We would expect to see similarities in mythology, in building techniques, in astronomical knowledge, in linguistic patterns. And guess what? We see exactly that. The flood myth is the most obvious example. More than 200 cultures around the world have flood legends in their mythology. From the biblical story of Noah to the epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, from the Hindu story of Manu to the Greek myth of Deucalion, from Chinese legends to Native American traditions, from Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories to Polynesian oral histories. Every major culture on Earth remembers a great flood. The details vary, but the core narrative is consistent. There was a time before humanity or the world became corrupt or was tested. A great flood came and destroyed almost everything. A few righteous people survived, usually with divine help. They repopulated the Earth and started civilization anew. Mainstream archaeology explains this as either coincidence, the result of local flooding events being mythologized, or collective memory of the post-Ice Age sea level rise. But the problem with these explanations is the specificity. These are not just vague stories about water. They describe sudden, catastrophic events. They describe a world before and a world after. They describe survival arcs or boats or floating sanctuaries. They describe the deliberate preservation of knowledge and species. These are not the characteristics of gradual sea level rise over thousands of years. These are the characteristics of something sudden, something traumatic, something that fundamentally changed the world. And there is geological evidence for exactly such an event. Scientists have identified what are called meltwater pulses, periods during the end of the last ice age, when massive amounts of ice melted very rapidly, causing sudden and dramatic sea level rises. Meltwater pulse 1 ampere occurred around 14,600 years ago and raised sea levels by as much as 65 feet in a matter of centuries, possibly decades. Meltwater pulse 1b happened around 11,500 years ago with similar effects. These were not gradual changes. These were catastrophic flooding events that would have devastated coastal civilizations. Imagine living in a thriving coastal city, a center of trade and learning, built on the shores of what you think is permanent land. And then, within a single lifetime, possibly within a single generation, the sea begins to rise. Not slowly, not gently, but aggressively, relentlessly. First, the beaches disappear, then the low-lying fields, then the outer neighborhoods of the city. People retreat inland, but the water keeps coming. Within decades, everything is gone. The entire geography of your world has changed. Your civilization's heartland is underwater. This is not mythology. This actually happened. And the people who experienced it would absolutely pass down stories about it. They would tell their descendants about the world that was lost, the great cities that sank, the knowledge that was nearly destroyed. So the flood myths are not evidence from you specifically, but they are evidence that something happened, something real and traumatic, something that was preserved in human cultural memory for thousands of years. And if there was a major civilization in the Pacific region, a civilization dependent on coastal resources and maritime trade, it would have been hit harder than almost anywhere else. The Pacific experienced some of the most dramatic sea level changes. A Pacific civilization would have been directly in the path of destruction. Now, let us talk about the people who survived these floods, who carried the memory and the knowledge forward. This is where the priest class becomes crucial to the story, because in the aftermath of a catastrophe like this, knowledge becomes the most valuable commodity. Not gold, not material wealth, those things can be rebuilt. But knowledge, especially complex knowledge about astronomy, agriculture, architecture, medicine, that knowledge can be lost forever if it is not deliberately preserved. This is why every ancient civilization we know of had a priest class or a scholarly elite whose primary function was knowledge preservation. In Egypt, it was the priests of the mystery schools. In Mesopotamia, it was the scribes and the temple scholars. In India, it was the Brahmin caste. In China, it was the Confucian scholars. In Mesoamerica, it was the priest astronomers. Every culture understood that someone needed to be responsible for maintaining and transmitting knowledge across generations. And if there was a civilization before these civilizations, a mother culture from which they descended, then logically there would have been an original priest class, an original knowledge-keeping tradition, and the survivors of the cataclysm, the ones who made it to higher ground, to the continental interiors, to the new coastlines, they would have been the ones carrying this tradition forward. They would have become the founders of the new civilizations, the legendary culture, heroes and teachers who appear in almost every ancient mythology. The Egyptians speak of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, a group of enlightened beings who came from somewhere else and taught the Egyptian civilization. The Sumerians credit the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea and brought knowledge. The Hindus speak of the 7 rishis who preserved the Vedas through the Great Flood. The Mayans reference Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god who brought civilization and learning. The Polynesians trace their lineage back to navigators and priests who came from Hiva or Hawaii, a distant homeland now lost. These are not independent inventions. These are variations on the same theme, knowledge bearers from an earlier time, preserving and transmitting the wisdom of a lost age. And the knowledge they transmitted was remarkable. Ancient peoples knew things they should not have known. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. The ancient Egyptians knew this. The Vedic texts reference it. The Mayan calendar incorporates it. How did scattered ancient cultures, supposedly disconnected from each other, all know about an astronomical phenomenon that requires centuries of careful observation to detect? They knew the Earth was round, not flat. Pythagoras knew it in ancient Greece, but so did ancient Indian mathematicians, and there are arguments that even earlier cultures understood this. The idea that everyone thought the Earth was flat until Columbus is a myth. Ancient knowledge keepers knew better. They knew the approximate size of the Earth. Eratosthenes famously calculated it in ancient Greece, but his method suggests he was working from existing knowledge, refining calculations, rather than starting from scratch. They had sophisticated mathematical knowledge. The Babylonians understood advanced geometry. The Egyptians used pi in the construction of the pyramids. The Mayans developed the concept of zero independently. These are not primitive cultures fumbling in the dark. These are societies with deep mathematical understanding. So where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is that each culture developed it independently, through gradual accumulation of observations and insights. But is that really satisfactory? Is it more likely that multiple disconnected cultures all independently developed complex astronomical and mathematical knowledge? Or is it more likely that they inherited this knowledge from a common source, an earlier civilization that had already done the work, and they were simply maintaining and building upon what had been passed down? The priest lineages claim the latter. They say they are the inheritors of ancient knowledge, the keepers of wisdom that predates their own civilizations. And when we look at the evidence, when we examine what ancient peoples actually knew and how sophisticated their understanding actually was, their claims start to seem less like mythology and more like history. The Pacific, with its vast expanses and its now submerged lands, is the perfect location for a lost civilization to have existed. The geological evidence supports it. The mythological evidence supports it. The cultural connections across vast distances support it. And the persistent traditions of knowledge-keeping priests, scattered across the Pacific Rim and beyond, all pointing back to a common source, support it. Was it called Mu? Maybe, maybe not. That might be a name created or preserved by Churchwood, or it might be a genuine fragment of ancient memory, but the name matters less than the reality. Somewhere, sometime, there was something before what we currently recognize as the dawn of civilization. Something was lost. Someone remembered. And those memories, those fragments of knowledge, those priestly lineages, they survived. They are still here, still guarding secrets that might reshape everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from. Before we go deeper into who these priests are and what they have been protecting all this time, I am curious. Where are you watching this from right now? What part of the world? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. There is something fascinating about people all over the planet, in different time zones, different countries, all coming together to explore these same ancient mysteries. Maybe some of you are watching from places where these stories originated, where your own ancestors might have been part of this lost history. That connection matters. So let me know where you are joining us from. When you strip away the romanticism and the speculation, what you are left with is a pattern across continents, across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. You find the same social structure, a dedicated class of individuals whose entire existence revolves around one purpose: preserving knowledge. Not just any knowledge. Sacred knowledge, hidden knowledge. Knowledge that is considered too important or too dangerous to be left to chance, to be written down where anyone could access it, or to be shared freely with the unprepared. These are not storytellers. These are not entertainers. These are specialists in memory, in transmission, in discretion. And when you start to examine these groups seriously, when you look at what they actually do and what they actually claim, something remarkable emerges. They are all doing essentially the same thing, using remarkably similar methods, protecting remarkably similar types of information. And many of them, when pressed, will tell you that their traditions do not originate with them. They are inheritors, carriers of something older. Take the kahuna of Hawaii. The word itself is often mistranslated as sorcerer or shaman, which gives entirely the wrong impression. A kahuna is more accurately understood as a master, an expert, someone who has achieved the highest level of knowledge in a particular domain. There are kahuna who specialize in canoe building, kahuna who specialize in medicine, kahuna who specialize in navigation. But the most secretive, the most carefully guarded lineage are the kahuna who specialize in what they call the hidden knowledge, the deep teachings about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. These kahuna operate under strict protocols. Knowledge is not given freely. It is earned through years of training, through demonstration of character, through initiation rites that test the student's readiness. Much of the teaching is oral, passed directly from master to student in settings where no one else is present. The knowledge is encoded in chants, in symbolic language, in practices that look simple on the surface but contain layers of deeper meaning for those who have been properly instructed. And here is what is fascinating. When anthropologists and researchers have managed to gain even partial access to these teachings, what they find is not primitive superstition. They find sophisticated psychological techniques, healing methods that demonstrably work, navigational systems of extraordinary precision, and cosmological models that, while expressed in spiritual language, contain concepts that parallel modern physics. The idea of mana, for instance, the life force that kahuna work with, shares conceptual similarities with ideas about bioelectric fields and subtle energies that fringe scientists are only now beginning to explore seriously. The Hawaiian kahuna trace their lineage back through generations, but they also speak of earlier teachers, ancestors who came from elsewhere, from a homeland that no longer exists. The chants reference kahiki, a place that is both a physical location and a spiritual concept, the source of the Hawaiian people and their knowledge. Some researchers have identified Kahiki with Tahiti or other Polynesian islands, but the kahuna themselves often speak of it in ways that suggest something more distant, more ancient, more fundamental. Now travel halfway around the world to India. The Naga priest lineages operate in a completely different cultural context, with different languages, different religious frameworks, different symbols, and yet the structure is eerily similar. The Naga traditions, found primarily in northeastern India and parts of Southeast Asia, center around a priest class that claims descent from the Nagas, the serpent beings of Hindu and Buddhist mythology. In the exoteric stories, the Nagas are supernatural creatures, guardians of treasures, beings of great wisdom and power, who live in underwater kingdoms or in subterranean realms. But within the esoteric traditions, the Naga priests will tell you something different. They will tell you that the Nagas were not mythological creatures, but an actual people, a lineage of knowledge keepers who possessed advanced understanding of natural forces, who knew how to work with what we might call subtle energies, who understood astronomy and mathematics and medicine at levels that seemed miraculous to those who did not share their training. The serpent symbolism, they explain, is not literal but represents wisdom, transformation, the kundalini energy that rises through the subtle body, the spiral structure that appears throughout nature from DNA to galaxies. The Naga priests preserve their knowledge through similar methods as the kahuna, oral transmission, symbolic encoding, selective initiation. They guard their teachings carefully, revealing them only to those they deem ready. And like the kahuna, they claim their knowledge is not original to them. They are inheritors of something much older, preservers of wisdom that survived a great catastrophe, knowledge that was brought to India by survivors from a land that was lost. In Tibet, the situation becomes even more intriguing. Before Buddhism arrived in Tibet, the indigenous religion was Bon. Now, after centuries of Buddhist dominance, Bon is often dismissed as primitive animism, superstitious practices that Buddhism superseded. But scholars who have studied Bon seriously, who have gained access to its actual teachings rather than its caricature, have found something quite different. Bon possesses a sophisticated philosophical system, complex meditation practices, medical knowledge that is remarkably effective, and cosmological teachings that include concepts about multiple dimensions, the cyclical nature of time, and the fundamental nature of consciousness that are startlingly modern in their implications. The Bon practitioners claim their tradition originated with Tonpa Shenrab, an enlightened teacher who came from a land called Olmo Lung Ring, often translated as the imperishable sacred land. The descriptions of this place in Bon texts are curious. It is said to be shaped like an 8-petaled lotus, to be divided into 4 regions, to be a place of great learning and advancement. Some scholars have attempted to identify it with various historical locations, perhaps Persia or Central Asia. But the Bon practitioners themselves often speak of it in ways that suggest it may no longer exist in its original form, that it may have been lost to some ancient catastrophe. What is particularly interesting about Bon is that it shares certain core practices and concepts with traditions found in other parts of the world, traditions that supposedly had no contact with Tibet. The use of the swastika as a sacred symbol, for instance, appears in Bon, in Hinduism, in ancient European cultures, in Native American traditions. The concept of a world mountain or world axis appears in Bon as Mount Meru, but similar concepts appear in Norse mythology as Yggdrasil, in Sumerian tradition as the cosmic mountain, in Mayan cosmology as the world tree. These could be independent inventions, or they could be fragments of a shared symbolic language, remnants of a common source. Cross the Pacific Ocean, and you find the Mayan priest astronomers, the Archean, whose knowledge of astronomy was so precise that it continues to baffle researchers. The Mayan calendar systems required centuries of continuous, accurate observation to develop. The Dresden Codex, one of the few Mayan texts that survived the Spanish conquest, contains eclipse tables that are accurate thousands of years into the past and future. These were not casual stargazers. These were specialists with institutional knowledge, with records passed down through generations, with methods that allowed them to make predictions that we can verify today with computers. The Mayan priests operated in a theocratic system where they held tremendous power specifically because they held knowledge. They could predict eclipses, which to the common people seemed like magic. They could track the movements of Venus with extraordinary precision, understanding its cycles in ways that were not matched in Europe until the age of telescopes. They had knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, which again requires long-term observations and sophisticated mathematical modeling, and the Mayans, like the others, spoke of their knowledge coming from earlier sources. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god, who appears in various forms across Mesoamerican cultures, was credited with bringing civilization, teaching astronomy, establishing the priestly orders. The myths describe him as coming from across the sea, from the east, from a place of great wisdom that was lost. Are we seeing a pattern yet? In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples have what is quite possibly the most stable and longest-lasting knowledge preservation system in human history. The Aboriginal tradition is not priest-based in the hierarchical sense, but they do have specialized knowledge keepers, individuals who are entrusted with specific stories, specific songs, specific information that is considered sacred and secret. These knowledge keepers, sometimes called clever men or women, undergo rigorous training and initiation. They are not self-appointed. They are selected, tested, and gradually brought into deeper levels of understanding. What makes the Aboriginal system so remarkable is its durability. These oral traditions have preserved accurate information for over 10,000 years. Stories about coastlines that changed, about animals that went extinct, about events that we can now verify through geological and paleontological evidence. This is not myth corrupted over time. This is accurate transmission of factual information across hundreds of generations. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories are often dismissed as primitive creation myths, but they are actually far more sophisticated than that. They are mnemonic systems, knowledge encoded in narrative form, designed to be memorable, to survive oral transmission, to carry information across vast spans of time. And within these stories are references to the same kinds of concepts we see elsewhere. The rainbow serpent, a creator figure that shares symbolic similarities with the Nagas of India, with Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, with serpent deities across cultures. The Seven Sisters, a story about the Pleiades star cluster that contains astronomical information, references to ancestors coming from across the sea, from lands that are now underwater. So here is what we have. Across the Pacific, across Asia, into Australia, into the Americas, we find specialized knowledge-keeping classes. They operate using similar methods. They preserve similar types of information. They use similar symbolic systems. They all claim their knowledge comes from earlier sources, often from places that were lost or destroyed. And they all maintain strict protocols about who receives what information and when. This is not coincidence. This is not parallel evolution. This is either evidence of ancient contact between these cultures, or evidence that they all descend from a common source, a mother culture that established these knowledge-keeping traditions and then scattered them across the world when that mother culture was destroyed. The mainstream explanation is diffusion, the idea that cultural practices spread gradually through trade routes and cultural contact, and certainly some of this happened. But diffusion does not adequately explain the deeper similarities, the core concepts that appear in cultures that were genuinely isolated from each other for thousands of years. It does not explain why these priest classes are all protecting the same kinds of secrets, using the same kinds of methods, pointing back to the same kinds of origin stories. The alternative explanation is the one the priests themselves offer. There was an original priesthood, an original knowledge-keeping class, in an original civilization. When that civilization was destroyed, the survivors scattered. They took their knowledge with them. They established new lineages in new lands. They adapted to new cultures, new languages, new environments. But at their core, they maintained the same essential mission: preserve the knowledge, protect the secrets, wait for the time when humanity is ready to receive the full truth. And what are these secrets they are protecting? The priests themselves are maddeningly vague about specifics, which is of course the entire point. But from the fragments that have been revealed, from the pieces that researchers have been able to gather, we can start to construct a picture. First, there is historical knowledge, the true timeline of human civilization, the real story of where we came from, what came before, what was lost. This alone would be revolutionary, but it is perhaps the least dangerous part of what they know. Second, there is practical knowledge, technologies, techniques, methods that the ancient civilization possessed. Not magic, but science we have lost or not yet rediscovered. Methods of construction that allowed them to move and shape massive stones with precision. Methods of healing that worked with the body's energy systems. Methods of consciousness exploration that allowed access to altered states and expanded awareness. Methods of working with sound, with frequency, with resonance in ways we are only beginning to understand. Third, there is cosmological knowledge, understanding of cycles, of patterns in time, of the relationship between celestial events and terrestrial effects. The knowledge that history is not linear but cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall in predictable patterns, that what happened before will happen again unless we learn from it. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, there is the knowledge of what caused the destruction. What actually happened 12,000 years ago? What brought down the advanced civilization that came before? Was it purely natural causes, a cosmic accident, an unavoidable catastrophe? Or was there a human element, a failure of wisdom, a misuse of technology that contributed to the disaster? This is the knowledge that makes the priests most cautious, most secretive. Because if humanity destroyed itself once through technological hubris or spiritual bankruptcy, then we need to be very certain we do not make the same mistake again. The priests are not sitting on this knowledge out of malice or a desire for power. They are sitting on it out of responsibility, out of a burden that has been passed down through countless generations. They are waiting for the signs that humanity is ready, that we have matured enough, that we have developed the wisdom to match our technological capabilities. And some of them believe that time is approaching. Some of them believe we are at a threshold, a point where the secrets can finally be revealed, where the knowledge can finally be shared, where the cycle can finally be broken. But the question remains, who decides when that time has come? Who has the authority to release knowledge that has been guarded for 100,000 years? And what happens when those secrets finally see the light of day? Let me tell you about something that should not be possible. In the highlands of Peru, at a site called Sacsayhuaman overlooking Cusco, there are stones that weigh over 100 tons. Not bricks, not manageable blocks. Massive, irregularly shaped boulders that have been cut, shaped, and fitted together with such precision that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone against stone, fitted so perfectly that the joints have survived earthquakes that destroyed more modern buildings around them. The conventional explanation is that the Inca, using bronze tools, rope, and human labor, somehow managed to quarry these massive stones, transport them miles from the quarry site, and then shape them to fit together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. But when modern engineers attempt to replicate this feat, using similar tools and methods, they fail. They cannot achieve the precision. They cannot manage the weight. They cannot explain how stones with such irregular surfaces were fitted together so perfectly that the entire wall flexes during earthquakes rather than crumbling. The Inca themselves, when the Spanish asked them about these structures, said they did not build them. They said these were the work of the ancestors, the people who came before, the ones who possessed knowledge that had been lost. The Spanish did not believe them. Modern archaeology does not believe them. But what if they were telling the truth? This is where the conversation about ancient technology becomes dangerous territory. Because once you start seriously considering that ancient peoples might have possessed capabilities we do not understand, you open a door that leads to some very uncomfortable questions. Questions about our assumptions, questions about our timeline, questions about what we think we know versus what we actually know. The priests of Mu, according to the legends, did not possess technology as we understand it. They possessed something different, a science that worked with natural forces in ways we have forgotten. The most persistent claim, the one that appears in traditions from Egypt to India to South America, involves crystals. Now, before you dismiss this as New Age nonsense, consider what crystals actually are. They are structured matter. They have precise geometric arrangements at the molecular level. They have specific resonant frequencies. They have piezoelectric properties, meaning they can convert mechanical pressure into electrical voltage, and vice versa. This is not mysticism. This is physics. We use crystals in almost every piece of modern technology. Your phone, your computer, your watch, they all contain crystal components precisely because crystals have unique properties that make them useful for storing and transmitting information and energy. The ancient priests supposedly understood this at a level we are only beginning to rediscover. The crystal skulls that appear in various collections around the world, whether they are genuinely ancient or more recent creations, point to a fascination with crystal working that spans cultures. More intriguingly, certain ancient sites show evidence of unusual crystal deposits or crystal incorporation into their structure. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, for instance, is made of granite, which contains quartz crystals. The chamber dimensions create specific acoustic resonances. When you combine piezoelectric materials with precise acoustic frequencies, you create conditions for unusual energy effects. Am I saying the Great Pyramid was a power plant or a consciousness amplifier or some other exotic device? I am saying that the people who built it understood properties of materials and frequencies that we are only now beginning to take seriously. The pyramid is not just a tomb. It is too complex, too precise, too deliberately engineered for that simple explanation. It is a device of some kind. What kind? That is the question the priest lineages may still have answers to. But crystals are only one piece of the puzzle. There is another claim that appears repeatedly in ancient texts and oral traditions, one that sounds even more impossible. The claim that ancient builders could manipulate gravity, or at least manipulate the weight of objects, using sound. The idea sounds absurd until you encounter the stories from multiple independent sources. Tibetan texts describe monks using drums and horns to levitate stones during construction. Arabic manuscripts reference similar techniques used in ancient Egypt. South American legends speak of priests who could make stones light enough to move easily through the use of specific chants or sound frequencies. Edward Leedskalnin, the builder of Coral Castle in Florida in the early 20th century, claimed to understand the secrets of the pyramid builders. Working alone at night, he somehow moved and erected massive coral blocks, some weighing many tons, to construct an elaborate complex. He used no modern machinery. No one ever witnessed his methods. When asked how he did it, he spoke cryptically about understanding the secrets of weight and leverage, about magnetic currents, about frequencies. He never fully explained his techniques, and he took his knowledge with him when he died. But Coral Castle stands as evidence that one man, using methods he would not reveal, accomplished something that engineering experts say should have required heavy equipment and multiple workers. Was Leedskalnin using acoustic levitation? We do not know. But here is what we do know. Acoustic levitation is real. Scientists can levitate small objects using focused sound waves. The principle is established. Sound waves create pressure differentials. With precise control of frequency and amplitude, you can create standing waves that exert upward force on objects, counteracting gravity. We can do this in laboratories with small objects. The question is, can it be scaled up? Can it be applied to massive stones? Modern science says no, the power requirements would be too great. But what if ancient science approached the problem differently? What if they understood resonance in ways we do not? What if they knew how to tap into natural frequencies, into the resonant frequency of the stones themselves, making them require far less energy to move? This is not fantasy. This is theoretical possibility based on established physics, just physics applied in ways we have not yet mastered. And if ancient peoples did master it, they would have possessed a tremendous advantage in construction, an advantage that would look like magic to anyone who did not understand the principles involved. Then there is the question of flight. The Vaimanika Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit text, describes in elaborate detail various types of flying machines called vimanas. It provides specifications for their construction, describes different propulsion systems, explains navigation techniques, discusses weaponry. Mainstream scholars dismiss it as either a medieval fantasy text or possibly even a 20th century fabrication. The language is suspicious. The technology described does not match anything we know from ancient India, and no physical examples of vimanas have ever been found. But here is the problem. The text exists. It describes technologies with internal consistency, and it is not alone. References to flying machines appear throughout Hindu and Buddhist texts. The Ramayana describes vimanas in elaborate detail, including aerial battles. The Mahabharata contains passages about weapons and vehicles that sound disturbingly like descriptions of advanced technology, or even nuclear warfare. Mountains melting, entire armies burned to ash, descriptions of blast effects, of radiation sickness symptoms, of devastation on scales that should not have been possible with ancient weapons. Are these literal descriptions of advanced technology, or are they mythological exaggerations? The problem is that the descriptions are too specific, too technical, too consistent across multiple texts to be pure fantasy. Something inspired these stories. Either the ancient authors had incredibly sophisticated imaginations, capable of inventing concepts that would not be developed for thousands of years, or they were describing something they had seen, something they had experienced, something that actually existed. And before you conclude that ancient flight is impossible, remember that we have examples of ancient peoples achieving things we still cannot fully explain. The Nazca lines in Peru are massive geoglyphs, some stretching hundreds of meters, that only make sense when viewed from the air. Why would anyone create ground drawings that can only be properly appreciated from a height that ancient peoples supposedly could not reach? The standard explanation is that they were meant for the gods, symbolic offerings to sky deities. But what if they had a more practical purpose? What if they were navigational markers, visible to pilots who could actually fly. The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq, is a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, with evidence of acid or acidic substance inside. When reconstructed, it produces electrical voltage. It is a working battery, dating to approximately 2,000 years ago. Why would ancient Mesopotamians need batteries? What were they powering? Conventional archaeology suggests it might have been used for electroplating jewelry, but that explanation feels inadequate. It feels like we are missing something, like this object is evidence of a level of understanding about electricity that should not have existed. The Antikythera mechanism is perhaps the most stunning example. Recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, it is a complex geared device with dozens of interlocking components, built around 2,000 years ago. When researchers finally figured out what it did, they were shocked. It is an astronomical computer, capable of predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, capable of predicting eclipses, capable of tracking the Olympic Games cycle. The level of engineering sophistication required to build this device was not matched in Europe until the 14th century. It should not exist, and yet it does. What else existed that we have not found? What other devices, what other technologies were built and then lost, leaving only fragments and legends behind? The priests who guard the knowledge of Mu speak of technologies that worked with consciousness directly, not machines in our sense, but devices that interfaced with human awareness, that amplified mental capabilities, that allowed communication across distances, that enabled healing through directed intention. This sounds like pure mysticism until you start looking at what modern science is discovering about consciousness, about the measurable effects of meditation on brain function, about the reality of psychic phenomena that mainstream science is still reluctant to acknowledge. The CIA's Stargate project, declassified in the 1990s, demonstrated that remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant locations through mental focus alone, produces results significantly above chance. The military took it seriously enough to fund research for over 20 years. They were not chasing fantasy, they were chasing capability. And if modern humans, with no special training beyond a few weeks or months of instruction, can demonstrate remote viewing abilities, what could trained priests, working within traditions that have been perfecting consciousness techniques for thousands of years, potentially achieve? The ancient Egyptians, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Indian yogis, the Mayan priests, they all developed sophisticated practices for altering consciousness, for achieving states of awareness that allowed access to information or capabilities beyond normal perception. Were these purely spiritual exercises? Or were they practical techniques, technologies of consciousness, methods for tapping into aspects of reality that we have forgotten how to access? The megalithic structures scattered across the world, from Stonehenge to the stone circles of Britain, from the temples of Malta to the platforms of Baalbek, they all share certain characteristics. They are built with massive stones. They are aligned to astronomical phenomena. They are located at sites with unusual electromagnetic or geological properties, and many of them produce measurable acoustic effects. When you make sound in certain chambers, the resonance creates physical sensations, altered states of consciousness, measurable changes in brain activity. Were these temples? Yes. Were they astronomical observatories? Yes. But were they also something more? Were they devices designed to create specific states of consciousness, to facilitate experiences that we would now label as mystical or psychic, but that the builders understood as practical applications of natural law? I know this sounds like I am wandering into territory that is difficult to defend, difficult to prove, but that is exactly the point. The technologies the priests are said to be protecting are not technologies we would recognize. They are not machines we can reverse engineer. They are understandings of natural principles that our current scientific paradigm either ignores or has not yet discovered. They are ways of working with consciousness, with sound, with natural energy fields, with the subtle aspects of reality that our instruments are not designed to measure. And perhaps that is why the priests keep these secrets. Not because they are hiding machines or blueprints or devices we could simply steal and use, but because the knowledge requires a completely different framework, a different way of understanding reality itself. You cannot give someone the technology without also giving them the worldview that makes the technology possible. And if that worldview, if that understanding, includes knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands or at the wrong time, then secrecy makes sense. The technologies of Mu, if they existed, were not separate from spirituality. They were integrated with it. They were based on an understanding that consciousness and matter, mind and energy, are not separate things but different aspects of the same fundamental reality. And that understanding, more than any specific technique or device, is perhaps the real secret the priests are protecting. Not how to build a flying machine or levitate a stone, but how to perceive reality in a way that makes such things possible. We are starting to approach that understanding again, from different angles. Quantum physics is revealing that observation affects reality, that consciousness plays a role in the behavior of matter at fundamental levels. Neuroscience is discovering that meditation and focused intention create measurable changes in brain structure and function. Energy medicine is demonstrating that the body has subtle energy systems that affect health and healing. We are slowly, piece by piece, rediscovering what may have been known and then lost. And as we rediscover it, as we build our technology and our understanding to the point where we can finally comprehend what the ancients knew, the priests may finally decide that the time has come, that humanity is ready, that the secrets can be revealed without catastrophic consequences. But that time is not yet, not quite. We still have more to learn, more to prove about our wisdom and our responsibility before the final doors are opened. Something happened 12,800 years ago, something so catastrophic, so world-altering, that it left a signature in ice cores, in geological strata, in the fossil record, and in the traumatized memories of every human culture that survived it. For most of the 20th century, mainstream science ignored this event or downplayed its significance. But in the last 2 decades, the evidence has become too overwhelming to dismiss. The question is no longer whether something happened. The question is what exactly happened, and why does it matter for us today? The event has a scientific name now, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. It sounds dry, academic, safe, but what it describes is anything but safe. Approximately 12,800 years ago, Earth was warming. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years were melting. Sea levels were rising gradually. Human populations were expanding, developing more sophisticated cultures, beginning the transition from nomadic hunting to settled agriculture. The world was changing, but it was changing in a predictable way. And then something hit us. The evidence suggests a fragmented comet, broken into multiple pieces, impacting across the northern hemisphere. Not one impact, multiple impacts. Airbursts over the ice sheets. Ground impacts in the oceans. A bombardment that lasted possibly hours, possibly days. The immediate effects would have been devastating. Massive explosions. Firestorms consuming forests across entire continents. Tsunamis generated by oceanic impacts racing across coastlines. The ice sheets, already weakening, fractured, and destabilized by the impacts, began to collapse in earnest. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning. The impacts threw enormous amounts of debris into the atmosphere. Dust, ash, vaporized rock. The sky darkened. Temperatures plummeted. The warming trend that had been underway reversed almost overnight. Earth plunged back into Ice Age conditions. This was the Younger Dryas period, a 1,000-year deep freeze that hit suddenly, killed off numerous species, and nearly exterminated humanity itself. The evidence for this event has been building for years. In 2007, a team of researchers published findings about a black mat layer found at archaeological sites across North America, a carbon-rich deposit dated to exactly 12,800 years ago, containing nanodiamonds, microscopic particles that only form under extreme temperatures and pressures, the kind created by cosmic impacts or airbursts. They found elevated levels of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. They found spherules, tiny glass beads formed when rock melts and then cools rapidly, exactly what you would expect from impact events. Initially, the hypothesis was controversial. Other scientists challenged the findings, questioned the dating, offered alternative explanations. But as more research accumulated, as more sites were examined, the evidence kept supporting the impact hypothesis. The black mat layer appears across North America, across Europe, across Asia. The platinum anomaly shows up in ice cores from Greenland. The nanodiamonds appear in sediment cores from multiple continents. This was not a localized event. This was global. And it correlates precisely with a mass extinction event. The megafauna of North America, giant mammals that had survived for millions of years, that had survived previous climate changes, suddenly went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, gone within a few centuries. The Clovis culture, the most widespread human culture in North America at the time, disappeared from the archaeological record almost overnight. Not gradually, suddenly. Now, here is where it connects to our story about Mu and the priests. Because 12,800 years ago is exactly the time frame that appears in the legends. Plato, writing about Atlantis, said it sank 9,000 years before his time, which places the event at approximately 11,400 years ago, close to the end of the Younger Dryas. The Hindu texts speak of the end of the last age of the world, the transition between yugas, occurring at a similar time frame. The Mayan calendar marks a previous world age, ending in catastrophe, at a date that, when converted to our calendar system, falls within this same general period. The oral traditions that speak of the flood, of the sinking of the motherland, of the destruction of the old world, they are not describing gradual sea level rise over thousands of years. They are describing sudden catastrophe. And now we know that sudden catastrophe actually happened. The question becomes, was there a civilization, an advanced civilization, that was destroyed by this event? Think about where advanced civilizations would develop. They develop on coastlines, along rivers, in fertile lowlands. They develop exactly in the places that would have been most vulnerable to the impacts and the subsequent flooding. The ice sheet collapses would have released unimaginable amounts of water. Sea levels did not rise gradually. They rose in pulses, in surges, in catastrophic floods, as ice dams broke and glacial lakes the size of small seas emptied into the oceans within days or weeks. If there was a Pacific civilization, a maritime culture dependent on coastal resources and oceanic trade, it would have been annihilated. The tsunami from even a single oceanic impact would have been hundreds of feet high. The subsequent sea level rise would have submerged the coastal cities, the ports, the centers of population and learning. The survivors would have been those who were inland, those who were at high elevations, those who had warning and fled. And who would have had warning? Who would have been watching the skies, tracking celestial objects, understanding orbital mechanics well enough to predict the danger? The priests, the astronomers, the knowledge keepers. This is what makes their claims so compelling. They say they preserved the knowledge through the catastrophe. They say they knew it was coming, or at least some of them did. The prophecy traditions, the cyclical time concepts, the careful tracking of celestial phenomena, these were not abstract spiritual exercises. These were survival skills. Know when the danger is coming. Prepare. Preserve what matters most. Survive. The Hopi prophecies speak of this explicitly. The Hopi tradition describes multiple previous worlds, each destroyed when humanity became corrupt or lost its way. The descriptions of how these worlds ended include fire falling from the sky, great floods, the earth shaking and breaking apart. These are not vague poetic metaphors. These are descriptions of impact events, of their immediate and secondary effects. And the Hopi say that a select few survived each destruction, people who were warned, people who prepared, people who maintained the right relationship with the sacred. These survivors became the seed of the next world, carrying forward the essential knowledge. The Tibetan texts contain similar concepts. The Kalachakra teachings describe cycles of time, ages of the world that rise and fall according to cosmic patterns. The texts provide astronomical calculations, methods for tracking these cycles, warnings about what happens when certain celestial alignments occur. Modern researchers who have studied these calculations seriously have found that they incorporate knowledge of precession, of long-period cycles in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, of patterns that play out over tens of thousands of years. Were the ancient Tibetan teachers simply brilliant astronomers who happened to notice these patterns? Or were they inheriting knowledge from those who had already seen the patterns play out, who had already experienced what happens when the cycles turn? The Hindu concept of the yugas is perhaps the most elaborate version of this cyclical understanding. The texts describe 4 ages, each lasting thousands of years, each characterized by different levels of spiritual awareness and material development. The Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, when humanity is most evolved; the Treta Yuga, when decline begins; the Dvapara Yuga, when further deterioration occurs; and the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, the age of maximum ignorance and suffering. According to Hindu chronology, we are currently in the Kali Yuga, which began approximately 5,000 years ago with the death of Krishna, and this Kali Yuga will last for hundreds of thousands of years before the next destruction and renewal. But here is the interesting part. The transition between yugas does not happen peacefully. The texts describe world-ending catastrophes, destructions by fire and flood, periods when nearly all life is exterminated before the cycle begins again. And these catastrophes are not random. They are connected to celestial events, to cosmic rhythms, to patterns that can be predicted by those who understand the mathematics of time. Is this real? Can catastrophes actually be predicted by understanding cosmic cycles? Modern astrophysics would say no. Impacts are random events. There is no predictable cycle of destruction. But that is not entirely true. We know that Earth passes through certain debris fields on a regular basis, creating meteor showers at predictable times each year. We know that the solar system has structure, that there are resonances and patterns in orbital mechanics. And we are beginning to understand that our solar system may pass through regions of interstellar space with different properties, different densities of cosmic dust and debris, on cycles that last millions of years. Could there be shorter cycles we have not yet detected? Could there be patterns in the inner solar system, perhaps related to the movement of large objects in the Kuiper Belt or the Oort cloud, that create periods of increased impact risk on timeframes of thousands or tens of thousands of years? If such cycles exist, and if an ancient civilization had been observing and recording astronomical data for long enough to detect them, they would possess predictive knowledge that we currently lack. This is what the priests claim. They claim to know the patterns. They claim to understand the cycles. And they claim that we are approaching another turn, another transition point, another time of potential catastrophe. Now, before this turns into pure doom prophecy, let me be clear about what we actually know versus what is speculation. We know the Younger Dryas impact happened. We know it caused a global catastrophe. We know many species and human cultures did not survive it. We know that human civilization, as we recognize it with cities and writing and complex social structures, only emerged after this event, in the following few thousand years. What we do not know for certain is whether there was an advanced civilization before the event. We have suggestive evidence, anomalies, structures and knowledge that are hard to explain using conventional chronology. But we do not have definitive proof. The ocean floors, where evidence would most likely be found, have barely been explored. Most archaeology focuses on land, on places we can easily access, not on continental shelves now submerged under hundreds of feet of water. What we also do not know is whether such catastrophes are cyclical and predictable. The impact hypothesis gives us one event. It does not prove a pattern. However, when we look at the geological record over millions of years, we do see patterns. Mass extinctions occur periodically. Some appear to be impact-related. Others are connected to volcanic activity, to climate shifts, to changes in ocean chemistry. The Earth is not a stable, unchanging system. It goes through cycles of stability and upheaval. That much is undeniable. The question that haunts me, and perhaps should haunt all of us, is this. If another major impact event occurred today, would our civilization survive? We are more advanced technologically than any previous human society, but we are also more vulnerable. We depend on complex, interconnected systems, global supply chains, electrical grids, computer networks, agriculture dependent on petroleum-based fertilizers and pesticides. If those systems failed, If a younger, drier scale event hit us now, how many would survive? Could we preserve our knowledge? Could we rebuild? This is why the priests guard their knowledge so carefully. They have seen, through inherited memory, what it looks like when a civilization falls. They know how fragile it all is. They know that everything we think is permanent and solid can disappear within a generation, leaving only fragments and stories and a desperate attempt to preserve something, anything, for those who come after. The cataclysm 12,800 years ago was not punishment from angry gods. It was not karma or divine judgment. It was physics, rocks falling from space, natural processes operating according to natural law. But to those who experienced it, to those who watched their world burn and drown, it would have seemed like the end of everything. And in many ways, it was. An entire epoch of human history, possibly an entire phase of human civilization, ended in fire and ice and flood. And if the priests are right, if the cycles are real, if the patterns repeat, then somewhere in the knowledge they guard is information about when it might happen again. Not to frighten us, not to control us through fear, but to prepare us, to give us a chance to do what our ancestors apparently could not, to survive with our knowledge intact, to ensure that if the cycle turns again, we are not starting over from zero, scrambling in the ruins trying to remember what we once knew. The Great Cataclysm is not ancient history. It is a living memory, preserved in tradition, encoded in ritual, guarded by those who understand that forgetting is the greatest danger of all. Easter Island sits in the most remote inhabited location on Earth, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, over 1,000 miles from the nearest other inhabited island. It is a tiny speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so isolated that discovering it should have been nearly impossible for ancient peoples with primitive navigation. And yet people found it, people settled it, and those people created something that continues to baffle us today. The moai, the giant stone heads, or more accurately, the giant stone figures, because most of them have bodies buried underground, bodies with hands, with details, with inscriptions. There are nearly 900 of them across the island, some standing, some fallen, some still in the quarry where they were being carved, abandoned mid-creation, as if the workers simply stopped one day and never returned. The largest completed moai weighs 82 tons. The largest one still in the quarry, never finished, would have weighed over 200 tons. Moving these figures, erecting them on platforms, placing multi-ton top knots of red stone on their heads, all of this required sophisticated engineering that the conventional narrative about Easter Island culture cannot adequately explain. But the moai are not even the most mysterious thing about Easter Island. That distinction belongs to the Rongorongo script. Wooden tablets covered in glyphs, a writing system that no one alive can read. Not the current inhabitants of the island, not linguists who have spent decades trying to decipher it. The script was suppressed by Christian missionaries in the 19th century who considered it pagan, and by the time researchers realized what had been lost, there was no one left who could read it. The tablets that survived, perhaps 24 of them scattered in museums around the world, are all we have, and they are silent, refusing to yield their secrets despite exhaustive analysis. What makes Rongorongo particularly intriguing is that it appears to be a fully developed writing system, not a simple pictographic record-keeping tool, but something more sophisticated. The glyphs are consistent, following apparent grammatical rules. They are written in a pattern called reverse boustrophedon, where every other line is upside down, requiring you to flip the tablet after reading each line. This is not something you would invent casually. This is a mature system, developed over time, serving a culture that needed to record complex information. What information? The islanders, when questioned by early European visitors, said the tablets contained the history of their people, the knowledge of their ancestors, the stories of where they came from. They spoke of Hiva, the ancestral homeland, a large land to the west that was their original home before coming to this isolated rock. When pressed about why they left Hiva, the stories varied. Some said overcrowding, some said conflict, but others said something different. They said Hiva sank, that it was swallowed by the sea. that only those who fled to the east, to the islands, survived. Now travel several thousand miles west from Easter Island, island hopping across Polynesia, Tahiti, the Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga, the vast Polynesian Triangle, spanning an area of ocean larger than most continents. And everywhere you go, you find the same thing. Cultures that are clearly related, speaking languages that are obviously connected, practicing similar customs, worshipping similar gods, building similar structures, and all of them sharing stories about navigating impossible distances, about finding tiny islands in an endless ocean, about ancestors who possessed knowledge that seems almost supernatural. Polynesian navigation is one of the most impressive achievements in human history, and we are only now beginning to understand how they did it. They navigated without instruments, without charts, without any of the tools that European explorers considered essential. Instead, they used star paths, memorized courses based on the rising and setting positions of specific stars. They used wave patterns, reading the subtle rebound waves created when ocean swells encounter islands, sensing land from dozens of miles away by the way the water moves. They used bird flight patterns, cloud formations, water temperature, bioluminescence. They turned the entire ocean into a readable text, extracting navigation data from phenomena that most people would not even notice. But here is the question that haunts researchers. How did they develop this knowledge? Navigation techniques this sophisticated required generations of development, of trial and error, of accumulated observation and testing. You cannot develop this knowledge by island hopping from one visible landmass to the next. You need a base, a large enough population and resource base to support specialized navigators, to maintain and transmit complex knowledge systems, to survive the inevitable failures and losses that come with exploring an unknown ocean. The Polynesian cultures claim they had exactly that. They speak of Hawaii, of Hiva, of different names for the same concept. A homeland, not a small island but a significant landmass. A place where their culture originated before dispersing across the Pacific. And they say this homeland no longer exists in its original form. It was lost to the sea. Could they be remembering Sundaland, the now submerged continent of Southeast Asia? The dates would work. Sundaland flooded as the Ice Age ended, with the final major inundations occurring around 8,000 years ago. Populations fleeing the rising waters would have migrated east into the Pacific, carrying their maritime knowledge with them, establishing new settlements on islands that remained above sea level. Over thousands of years, through countless generations, they refined and adapted their navigation techniques, becoming the master seafarers we know as the Polynesians. But there is another possibility, one that connects even more directly to the Mu hypothesis. What if there was a Pacific culture, a maritime civilization, that existed before the flooding? And what if the Polynesians are their descendants? What if the navigation knowledge, the astronomical understanding, the sophisticated oral traditions that Polynesian cultures maintain are all inheritances from this earlier source? This would explain why Polynesian navigation seems so advanced, so fully formed. It would explain why their mythologies consistently point back to a lost homeland. It would explain the Rongorongo script, which might be a late survival of a much older writing system, preserved on isolated Easter Island long after it was lost elsewhere. Now shift your attention to the Indian Ocean, to the southern tip of India, to the Tamil culture that we discussed earlier. The Tamils are adamant about their history. They are not vague about Kumari Kandam the way some other cultures are vague about their lost homelands. Tamil literature provides specific details. 3 Sangams, great academies of poets and scholars. The first Sangam lasted 4,440 years. The second lasted 3,700 years. These timescales seem impossibly long until you remember that the Tamils are measuring from before the floods, from when more land existed, from when their civilization had room to develop over many millennia. The Tamil Sangam literature that survives dates to approximately 2,000 years ago, but the texts reference earlier works, earlier poets, earlier compositions that are now lost, and they speak explicitly about land that is now underwater, about cities that are now beneath the sea, about rivers that flowed through lands that no longer exist. For decades, this was dismissed as mythology. But geological surveys have confirmed that the continental shelf off the southern coast of India was indeed above water during the Ice Age. The Tamils are not making it up. Their ancestors lived on that land. They remember when it was there. They remember when it flooded. What makes the Tamil case even more interesting is the linguistic evidence. Tamil is part of the Dravidian language family, which is distinct from the Indo-European languages that dominate most of India and Europe. The Dravidian languages are older, indigenous to the Indian subcontinent, predating the arrival of Indo-European speakers. And here is where it gets fascinating. There are linguistic similarities between Dravidian languages and certain language families in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, not close enough to prove direct descent, but close enough to suggest ancient contact, ancient connections that mainstream linguistics struggles to explain. Could there have been a maritime culture, a Pacific Rim civilization that connected these regions before the flooding, a culture that left linguistic fingerprints, cultural influences, shared knowledge systems across vast distances? The more you look, the more connections appear. Aboriginal Australian cultures, as we have mentioned, have the longest continuous oral traditions on Earth, and their stories include references to interactions with peoples who came from the sea, visitors from the north, traders, or travelers from distant lands. Some Aboriginal rock art depicts figures in boats, figures with different physical features than the Aboriginal people, images that suggest contact with outsiders long before European arrival. The Aboriginal groups in northern Australia have words in their languages that appear to be loan words from Austronesian languages, the language family that includes Polynesian, Indonesian, and Melanesian tongues. This suggests contact, trade, cultural exchange spanning back thousands of years. And if there was regular contact, regular maritime trade across these distances, that implies a level of seafaring capability and cultural organization that we do not usually attribute to Stone Age cultures. The megalithic phenomenon provides another layer of connection. Starting around 6,000 years ago, and continuing for several thousand years, cultures around the world suddenly began building with massive stones. Not everywhere, but in enough places to create a pattern. Europe saw the construction of Stonehenge, Karnak, Newgrange, and thousands of other megalithic sites. The Mediterranean saw the temples of Malta, some of the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth. The Middle East saw Göbekli Tepe and similar sites in Turkey and the Levant. India built sophisticated stone temples. Southeast Asia erected monuments. South America developed megalithic traditions that culminated in the precision stonework of the Inca. Easter Island carved the Moai. These cultures were supposedly disconnected from each other, developing independently, yet they were all doing the same thing at roughly the same time, building with massive stones, orienting their structures to astronomical phenomena, incorporating sacred geometry into their designs, creating monuments meant to last for millennia. Why? What inspired this global building boom? The conventional explanation is that it was an independent invention, that as cultures developed agriculture and surplus resources, they naturally started building monumental architecture. But that does not explain the similarities in technique, in orientation, in purpose. It does not explain why cultures separated by oceans were solving the same engineering problems in similar ways. The alternative explanation is transmission, that these cultures were connected, if not directly then through intermediaries. That knowledge was being shared, techniques were being transmitted, possibly by a seafaring culture that could travel between these regions, possibly by the scattered remnants of a civilization that once existed and was now spreading its knowledge to new lands. The priest lineages, the knowledge keepers, traveling from place to place, teaching, advising, helping new cultures develop the capabilities that the old civilization once possessed. This might sound like fantasy, but consider the Beaker people of prehistoric Europe. They appear in the archaeological record around 4,500 years ago, characterized by their distinctive pottery style, their metalworking skills, and their apparent habit of traveling long distances. Within a few centuries, Beaker artifacts appear across Europe, from Iberia to Britain to Central Europe. They were not conquerors. They were travelers, traders, possibly teachers. They spread metallurgical knowledge, They influenced local cultures, and then they seemed to disappear, absorbed into the populations they encountered. Were they carrying forward knowledge from an earlier time, from an earlier source? We cannot prove it, but the pattern is suggestive. The more we examine the ancient world with fresh eyes, with willingness to question our assumptions, the more we see connections, linguistic similarities that should not exist, mathematical concepts appearing in widely separated cultures at similar times, architectural techniques that parallel each other across oceans, astronomical knowledge that required long-term observation and sophisticated calculation, showing up in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Either human beings, independently, all over the world, kept inventing the same solutions to the same problems, kept discovering the same mathematical principles, kept developing the same astronomical knowledge, kept building monuments with the same orientations and purposes. Or there was contact, there was transmission, there was a source, a root culture, a civilization that existed before what we call the beginning, and that civilization's knowledge spread across the world through survivors, through traders, through priests, through the scattered remnants who carried forward what they could save from the catastrophe. The global connections are not proof of mu, but they are evidence of something that does not fit neatly into our established timeline, something that suggests human history is more complex, more interconnected, more ancient than we have been taught. And if the priests are right, if they really are the inheritors of this lost knowledge, then they know the full story of these connections. They know how the pieces fit together. They know where we came from and how we got here, and they are still deciding whether we are ready to hear the complete truth. Let me be very careful here, because we are entering territory where evidence gets mixed with speculation, where legitimate questions get tangled with paranoia, and where it becomes very easy to slip into conspiracy thinking that has no basis in reality. But there are questions that need to be asked. Questions about why certain discoveries are ignored or dismissed. Questions about who decides what is legitimate archaeology and what is pseudoscience. Questions about whether there are institutional interests in maintaining a particular narrative about human history. The conventional timeline of human civilization is not just an academic matter. It is foundational to how we understand ourselves, how we structure education, how we think about progress and development. We teach children that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago. That writing was invented around 5,000 years ago. That advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering emerged gradually over the past few millennia. This is the story, and this story serves a purpose. It tells us that we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, that we are smarter, more capable, more advanced than any peoples who came before. It is a comforting narrative. But what happens when evidence appears that contradicts this narrative? What happens when sites are discovered that seem too old? When artifacts appear that show too much sophistication? When knowledge systems are found that should not have existed? In an ideal world, the scientific community would embrace these anomalies, investigate them rigorously, and adjust the timeline accordingly. But in practice, that is not always what happens. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is a perfect example. When it was first excavated in the 1990s, it immediately created problems for established archaeology. Here was a massive complex of carved stone pillars, elaborate structures, sophisticated artwork, dating to 11,600 years ago. That places it firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans were supposedly just beginning to experiment with agriculture, living in small settlements, possessing limited organizational capability. Yet Göbekli Tepe required coordinated labor from hundreds of people, advanced stoneworking techniques, and a level of cultural sophistication that should not have existed. The initial response from much of the archaeological community was skepticism. The dating must be wrong. The interpretation must be flawed. This cannot be as old and as advanced as it appears. But as more evidence accumulated, as more excavation confirmed the dates and revealed more of the site, the skeptics were forced to acknowledge the reality. Göbekli Tepe exists. It is as old as claimed, and it requires a fundamental rethinking of the timeline of human social development. But here is the interesting part. Even as Göbekli Tepe has been accepted as genuine, Even as it has forced some revision of thinking about the Neolithic period, there has been resistance to following the implications further. If humans could build Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, what else might they have been capable of? What other sites might exist that are equally old or older? What does this say about the possibility of more advanced cultures existing even earlier, before the Younger Dryas catastrophe? These questions make many archaeologists uncomfortable, not because they are bad scientists, but because accepting these possibilities requires dismantling a century of established scholarship, rewriting textbooks, acknowledging that previous generations of experts were wrong about fundamental issues. Academic careers are built on established paradigms. Funding comes from institutions that expect research to fit within accepted frameworks. Publishing in prestigious journals requires peer review from people who were trained in the old model and who may not be receptive to ideas that challenge it. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional inertia. This is the normal functioning of a conservative profession that values consensus and continuity. But the effect is the same as if there were a deliberate cover-up. Evidence that does not fit gets sidelined. Researchers who pursue controversial theories get marginalized. Alternative interpretations get labeled as fringe or pseudoscientific, not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they are disruptive. Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, and other researchers who have proposed earlier dates for the Sphinx, who have argued for pre-Younger Dryas civilizations, who have suggested that mainstream archaeology is missing something important, they have all faced fierce criticism from establishment archaeologists. Not just scholarly disagreement, but personal attacks, accusations of irresponsibility, efforts to discredit them and keep their work out of mainstream academic discourse. Why? If their theories are so obviously wrong, why not simply present the evidence against them and let the matter rest? Why the emotional response? Why the need to actively suppress alternative viewpoints? One answer is that institutions protect themselves. Archaeology as a profession has built its authority on being the sole arbiter of the past, the only legitimate source of information about ancient history. When outsiders, especially popular writers who reach mass audiences, present alternative theories, it threatens that authority. It suggests that the experts might not have all the answers, that amateurs or interdisciplinary researchers might notice things the specialists missed. This is threatening to any established field. But there may be another factor at play, one that is more speculative but worth considering. Ancient sites are not just academic curiosities. They are cultural treasures, tourist attractions, sources of national pride, and in some cases, strategic assets. Governments and institutions have interests in controlling the narrative about these sites, in maintaining certain interpretations, in preventing alternative theories from gaining traction. The Egyptian government, for example, has been notoriously resistant to new dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx. When Robert Schoch presented geological evidence that the Sphinx shows water erosion patterns consistent with exposure to heavy rainfall, which would date it to before the aridification of Egypt around 7,000 years ago, the response from Zahi Hawass and the Egyptian archaeological establishment was not to investigate further, but to reject the claim outright. The Sphinx is 4,500 years old, built by Khafre in the 4th dynasty, and that is the end of the discussion. Why the inflexibility? Perhaps because tourism and national identity are tied to the conventional narrative. Egypt markets itself as the cradle of civilization, home to one of the oldest and greatest ancient cultures. If the monuments turn out to be even older, built by people who came before the dynastic Egyptians, that complicates the story in ways that are politically and economically inconvenient. The Vatican presents a different kind of puzzle. The Vatican Library and the Vatican Secret Archives contain millions of documents, manuscripts, and texts, some of them quite ancient. What is in there? We do not fully know. Access is highly restricted. Scholars can request to see specific items, but they need to know what they are looking for, and they need permission. The idea that the Vatican is sitting on suppressed knowledge about ancient civilizations or lost histories is a staple of alternative history speculation. Is there any truth to it? Probably not in the dramatic sense of secret texts proving Atlantis or revealing alien contact, But the Vatican does have a complex relationship with indigenous knowledge systems and with evidence that might complicate Christian historical claims. The Church spent centuries suppressing indigenous religions, destroying texts, eliminating practices it considered pagan or heretical. The burning of the Mayan codices, the suppression of indigenous knowledge across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, these were deliberate acts meant to erase alternatives to Christian cosmology. Did some of those suppressed texts contain historical information, astronomical knowledge, or cultural memories that would have reshaped our understanding of the past? Almost certainly. And we will never know what was lost because the destruction was so thorough. Then there is the question of government interest in ancient knowledge and ancient sites. This is where we have to be especially careful, because this is where evidence gets thinnest and speculation runs wildest. But there are documented cases of government agencies taking interest in phenomena that touch on ancient mysteries. The CIA's Stargate project is the most famous example. From the 1970s through the mid-1990s, the CIA and various military intelligence agencies funded research into remote viewing, the alleged ability to perceive distant locations through psychic means. The program was eventually declassified, and the results were mixed. Some remote viewers achieved results that were statistically significant, better than chance, and useful for intelligence purposes. Others did not. The program was eventually shut down, officially because the results were not reliable enough for operational use. But the fact that it existed at all tells us something important. Government agencies were willing to investigate fringe phenomena, to take seriously the possibility that consciousness might work in ways that mainstream science does not acknowledge. If they were interested in remote viewing, were they also interested in other aspects of ancient knowledge, in techniques that traditional cultures claimed gave access to information or capabilities beyond normal perception? We know that intelligence agencies have taken interest in certain ancient sites. There are documented cases of archaeological sites in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in South America, where military or intelligence personnel have been present, sometimes for reasons that are not entirely clear. Are they just protecting sites from looting? Are they looking for something specific? Are there concerns about what might be found? Antarctica adds another layer of mystery to this discussion. Antarctica is the most inaccessible continent, covered in ice miles thick, barely explored below the surface. But we know from radar and satellite imaging that there are mountain ranges, valleys, and landforms beneath the ice. And we know that Antarctica was not always frozen. Millions of years ago, it had temperate climate, forests, life. Could it have been inhabited? Could there be evidence of ancient human presence beneath the ice? The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, forbidding military activity, nuclear testing, and mineral mining. On the surface, this seems like an enlightened international agreement. But it also means that access to Antarctica is controlled, that exploration is limited to approved scientific missions, that whatever is under the ice remains largely unexplored and inaccessible to independent researchers. Some alternative researchers suggest this is not coincidental, that the treaty exists partly to prevent uncontrolled discovery of whatever might be preserved beneath the ice. This is speculation, but it is not entirely unreasonable speculation. The common thread in all of these examples is control. Control of information, control of access, control of narrative. Whether it is academic institutions protecting their authority, governments protecting strategic or cultural interests, or religious organizations protecting theological claims, there are multiple layers of interest in maintaining the established story and preventing alternative narratives from gaining legitimacy. Does this mean there is a coordinated conspiracy to hide the truth about ancient civilizations? No. What it means is that there are structural reasons why evidence that challenges the mainstream narrative faces resistance, why researchers who pursue controversial theories face obstacles, why access to certain sites and certain information is restricted. You do not need a conspiracy when institutional incentives naturally push in the same direction. But that makes the situation in some ways more difficult than if there were a simple conspiracy. You cannot expose a conspiracy that does not exist. You cannot point to a villain who is deliberately hiding the truth. What you can do is recognize the systemic biases, the institutional interests, the structural factors that make certain types of knowledge difficult to pursue and certain types of evidence difficult to validate. And you can support researchers who are willing to work outside the mainstream, who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, who are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to conclusions that challenge established authority. The knowledge keepers, the priests of Mu if they exist, do not need to worry about government agencies or archaeological establishments suppressing their secrets. They are doing that themselves, for their own reasons. But they may be watching to see whether we, as a civilization, are capable of handling knowledge that challenges our assumptions, whether we can look at evidence honestly without letting our preconceptions blind us, whether we have developed the wisdom to match our curiosity. And so far, the answer remains unclear. So where does that leave us? After 2 hours of exploring ancient mysteries, examining evidence, following threads that connect cultures across oceans and millennia, asking uncomfortable questions about what we know and what we have been taught, what can we actually say with confidence? Here is what we know for certain. Human history is longer and more complex than the standard textbooks acknowledge. Sites like Göbekli Tepe prove that sophisticated cultures existed far earlier than we thought possible. The Younger Dryas impact event happened, causing global catastrophe that nearly exterminated humanity and definitely exterminated numerous species. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, submerging vast coastal areas where people lived, where cultures developed, where evidence of early civilization would have been concentrated. Ancient peoples possessed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that we are still struggling to explain. Oral traditions from cultures around the world preserve accurate information spanning thousands of years, including memories of catastrophic floods and lost homelands. These are facts, not speculation, not fringe theories. These are conclusions supported by mainstream geology, archaeology, and anthropology, even if their full implications make many scholars uncomfortable. Here is what remains uncertain but plausible. There may have been one or more advanced cultures before what we currently recognize as the beginning of civilization. These cultures, if they existed, would have been concentrated in coastal areas now underwater, which explains why we have found so little direct evidence. The catastrophe 12,800 years ago would have destroyed most of their infrastructure and killed most of their population. The survivors would have carried fragments of knowledge to new locations, establishing the cultures we know as the first civilizations, but actually serving as inheritors and transmitters of older wisdom. The priest classes, the knowledge keepers we see in every ancient culture, may indeed trace their lineages back to this earlier source. This is not proven, but it fits the evidence better than the conventional narrative of independent invention and gradual development. It explains the anomalies, the advanced knowledge, the global similarities, the persistent myths about lost homelands and great floods. It provides a framework that makes sense of what we observe. And here is what we do not know and may never know with certainty. Was there specifically a Pacific civilization called Mu or Lemuria? Did this civilization possess technologies we have lost? Are there still priest lineages actively guarding secrets passed down for 100,000 years? Are there hidden texts, preserved artifacts, concealed knowledge that would rewrite our entire understanding of the human journey? Maybe. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The testimonies are consistent but unverifiable. The possibilities are tantalizing but frustratingly out of reach. But perhaps that is exactly the point. Perhaps the real lesson here is not about what we can prove, but about what we can imagine, about keeping our minds open to possibilities beyond what we have been taught, about recognizing that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when that evidence would be buried under hundreds of feet of ocean, or ice, or sand, about respecting the knowledge systems of indigenous cultures instead of dismissing them as primitive mythology, about understanding that modern industrial civilization is not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely one expression of human potential, and possibly not even the most impressive one. The priests of Mu, whether they are a literal reality or a symbolic representation of ancient wisdom traditions, are asking us a question. Not about them, about us. Are we wise enough to handle knowledge that challenges our assumptions? Are we humble enough to admit that we might not have all the answers? Are we responsible enough to be entrusted with power that could be used for good or for destruction? Are we mature enough as a species to survive our own capabilities? These are not abstract philosophical questions. These are immediate, practical concerns. We live in an age where we possess technologies that can alter the climate, modify genetics, split atoms, and potentially destroy all complex life on Earth. We have tremendous power. Do we have proportionate wisdom? The track record is not encouraging. We are heating the planet despite knowing the consequences. We are depleting resources despite knowing they are finite. We are building weapons despite knowing the horror they cause. We have knowledge without wisdom, capability without restraint, power without responsibility. If there was a civilization before ours that destroyed itself through similar failures, then we need to know that. We need to understand what they did wrong so we can avoid making the same mistakes. And if there are knowledge keepers who have preserved that understanding, who are waiting for us to demonstrate that we are ready to receive it, then perhaps the most important question is not what secrets they hold, but what we need to do to prove ourselves worthy of those secrets. Maybe the secret is not a specific piece of information or technology. Maybe the secret is a way of being, a relationship with the world, an understanding of our place in the larger cosmos. The ancient cultures that survived the catastrophe, that rebuilt civilization from the ruins, they all emphasized balance, harmony, respect for natural forces, understanding of cycles and patterns. These were not just spiritual ideals. These were practical survival strategies, lessons learned through terrible experience, wisdom purchased at the cost of unimaginable suffering. We are approaching crisis points ourselves. Climate change, resource depletion, potential for nuclear or biological catastrophe, artificial intelligence that may exceed our control. We are building toward a threshold, a point where the decisions we make will determine whether our civilization survives or follows the pattern of previous collapses. This is not alarmism. This is simple observation of trends and trajectories. The knowledge keepers, if they exist, are watching. They are watching to see whether we will learn in time, whether we will develop the wisdom to match our knowledge, whether we will choose a different path than the one that led to previous destructions. And they are deciding whether to intervene, whether to reveal what they know, whether to give us one more piece of information that might make the difference. But they cannot save us. Even if they handed us every secret, every technique, every piece of ancient knowledge they possess, it would not matter if we lack the wisdom to use it properly. The technology does not save the civilization. The consciousness saves the civilization. The understanding that we are part of a larger whole, that our actions have consequences spanning generations, that short-term gain at the cost of long-term sustainability is suicide. These are the insights that matter. So here is what I believe. After examining all this evidence, after following all these threads, after considering all these possibilities, I believe there was something before. I believe we have forgotten more than we know. I believe the priests and the knowledge keepers are real, in one form or another, and they are protecting something important. And I believe that what they are protecting is not primarily information but responsibility, the understanding that knowledge is a burden as much as a gift, that power requires wisdom, that the future depends on choices made in full awareness of consequences. The secret of the priests of Mu, if there is one, is this. Civilizations rise and fall, cycles turn, catastrophes happen, but the knowledge can survive if someone takes responsibility for preserving it, protecting it, transmitting it to those who are ready. That is the role the priests have played for however many thousands of years. Not to hoard power, but to protect wisdom. Not to control humanity, but to serve it by ensuring that when we are finally ready, when we have finally matured enough as a species, the knowledge will still be there, waiting for us. Are we ready? That is the question. Not whether the secrets exist, not whether we can force them into the open through research or investigation or pressure, but whether we have earned the right to receive them through our demonstrated wisdom, our proven responsibility, our genuine commitment to using knowledge for the benefit of all life, rather than the benefit of the few or the destruction of the many. If you have watched this entire documentary, if you have followed this journey from the Naga stones of Myanmar through the lost continent of Mu, through the priest lineages, and their secret technologies, through the great cataclysm and the global connections, through the questions about modern cover-ups and the final questions about readiness and responsibility, then you are part of something important. You are part of a growing number of people who are asking the right questions, who are willing to look beyond the official narratives, who are seeking deeper truths about who we are and where we came from. Share this video with others who are ready to ask these questions, not to convince them of any specific answer, but to open their minds to the possibilities, to encourage them to look at the evidence themselves, to join this community of seekers and questioners who refuse to accept easy answers or comfortable lies. And turn on those notifications, because this is just the beginning. We have barely scratched the surface of these mysteries. There are more stories to tell, more evidence to examine, more questions to ask. The priests may be waiting to see if we are ready, but while we are waiting for their judgment, we can prepare ourselves. We can learn, we can question, we can develop the wisdom that knowledge requires. The 100,000-year-old secret is not a fact to be learned. It is a responsibility to be accepted. And when enough of us understand that, when enough of us demonstrate that we are ready, then perhaps the doors will finally open, and the full story of humanity's journey will finally be revealed. Until then, we keep searching, we keep questioning, we keep the flame of curiosity alive, just as the priests have kept the flame of knowledge alive through the long night of forgetting. The story continues, and you are now part of it. And if you are watching this at 3 a.m, unable to sleep because your mind is racing with questions about what came before, about what we have forgotten, about what the priests still know, leave a comment with just one word: Mew. Let me know you made it to the end. Let me know you are ready for what comes next. Because the priests are not the only ones keeping secrets. There are more mysteries waiting, and some of them are even harder to believe than what you have just heard.